Qwul'sih'yah'maht, Qwul'sih'yah'maht, Tanitsin, Layaksins, Nanemo, Stolo. So I've told you my name is Robina Thomas. My traditional name is Qwul'sih'yah'maht, and that I'm a member of Layaksin First Nation. But through my grandmother and honoring my matrilineal lines, I would belong to the Snuneymuxw or Nanaimo First Nations. And through my grandfather, the Stolo territory. I thank the Songhees and Esquimalt people for allowing me to live, learn, and love in their traditional territory. And thank you all for being here today. Just welcome to the First Peoples House. I don't know, has everyone been to the First Peoples, into the ceremonial hall before? Yes? Hands? No? So just a couple things about it then, if you first, because I see some people not raising their hands. So, this house has been open now for 5 years. It came about through a strategic plan. The university had many, many years ago that said we were failing to meet the needs of Indigenous students at the University of Victoria. And one of the things that the School of Social Work put forward was that maybe if we had a place for First Nations people to come together, that would be a first step in achieving that goal of recruiting, retaining Indigenous students. And so after years and years and years of planning and being in strategic plans and working its way up so that it actually became a goal of the university, 5 years ago we opened the doors of this house. We did major consultation all on the south, of all the Coast Salish chiefs from Qualicum down. We went door to door in person to every one of those communities, and we said, we're thinking of building a First Peoples House at the University of Victoria. Do we have your support, and how would you like the house to look? And I think when we're talking about partnerships, it's really important for us to share a little bit of this history, because it is about partnerships and relationships. So we did that, we did those door-to-door visits, and when we got everyone's okay that yes, they thought this was a good idea, we started to plan what the house would look like. The first thing that all the chiefs said is that it had to represent Coast Salish culture and traditions. And so if you look around, it represents an old lean style house that we used to use years and years ago. And this room kind of more represents what you might see in a traditional Feet Lalem or big house in the Coast Salish sense. But there's many things I could talk all day about what the house means. The outside posts are Coast Salish. And as you come in, and in here we represent the three nations on Vancouver Island as a way of acknowledging that there are three distinct nations on Vancouver Island, the Coast Salish, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Qwul'sih'yah'maht. But what's most important for us to think about today as we move forward in this final session is that when you walk in, the front door, just to your right-hand side on the wall, is a small poster that says welcome, and we're really glad you're here. But it also says that we ask you to come in Qwul'sih'yah'maht with a good mind and a good heart. We ask you to come in being open to learning new ways of knowing and being. And we ask you to leave all of your negative feelings outside the door. In our big houses, the elders always tell us, you leave your negative feelings on a hook outside the door of the big house, and then you come in open to the activities that are going to happen that day. And in the big house that we do our traditional work in, the elders say, if you really want to take it when you go, grab it. If it's that important to carry that negativity, just grab it and carry it with you. But if not, leave it there. And the ancestors and Mother Earth will take those negative feelings. And so today, we welcome you here, and we really hope that you figure out how you can embrace that teaching of Qwul'sih'yah'maht.
Thanks, Robina. I'm Leslie Brown. I'm the director of the Institute for Studies in Innovation and Community University Engagement. And we're the center, along with Robina, who is the director of Indigenous Academics and Community Engagement, and Charlotte, who will introduce herself in a moment, who is the director of the Center for Aboriginal Health Research, have been sponsoring this three-part series on working with Indigenous communities. And for those of you, how many were at the first one with Robina and I? Protocols of Dignity. Great. So that's where we talked about working with a model that Robina and I have developed around protocols of dignity. And then the second one, that was about engagement. How do you engage in communities? The second one was about decolonization with Charlotte and Sherry Puyak. How many people were at that one? Good. Perfect. So we've had engagement, we've had decolonization, and then this third one is about partnerships. And so we're really glad to have some people who've been at some before and some new people. And for those of you who missed the first two, they have been videotaped and they're on the Institute website. So just go to uvic.ca/Qwul'sih'yah'maht and you'll get to those tapes if you want to see what happened in the first two sessions. So I welcome you today, and I'll turn it over to Charlotte to introduce herself.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you all again. So I'm Charlotte Loppie. I'm over at the Center for Aboriginal Health Research. I'm also a professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy. Teach mostly in the Indigenous health stream of that. And originally from Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq and French Acadian ancestry. And so I've been a grateful visitor here on Coast Salish territory for 6 years. Yeah, so it's nice to see everyone. I see you're in a nice little horseshoe configuration, which shows your fear of us. So it's okay too. I like people to be a little afraid of me. So I'm just joking. Anyway, nice to meet you all.
As I plug this in, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that we're cognizant of is for a lot of people, a lot of communities, the history of that partnership between academics and Indigenous communities is not necessarily a positive one. We can probably all agree with that. And so one of the things that we want to acknowledge that, and that we have to consider that history in order for us to move forward and learn from past mistakes, but also learn from opportunities that we've been given to pursue this in a different way.
Yep. What we've got up here is understanding the history, and if you recall the first one, Protocols of Dignity, which is really talking about understanding the history and the future, and if you know those, then it helps you figure out what to do in the present. So the history of research relationships between academics and Indigenous communities is key to start with, as Charlotte said. And the idea that partnerships can be formal or informal. And those of you who were at that first one, we talked about the agreement, the WSÁNEĆ agreement. I mean, it's those of you we talked about, and you all got copies, I think, we sent them out, of an agreement between UVic and the WSÁNEĆ School Board that really talks about how we're going to be together as opposed to what we're going to do together. And so that's a more formal kind of arrangement, but then on an individual basis, as researchers working with communities, sometimes they can be informal and everything in between, and sometimes they go back and forth. The whole idea of partnerships and research partnerships are founded on this concept of knowledge democracy. In other words, that we can't really have social justice or any other kind of justice in the world until we have cognitive justice, where we've got a sense that there's all different kinds of ways of knowing and being, and each are respected for their own worth. And so the idea of that there's a knowledge democracy movement underneath that is the foundation for building relationships between researchers and Indigenous communities, that we co-create knowledge, that it isn't us taking Indigenous knowledge into the academy, it's the academy and Indigenous communities working together to co-create knowledge, and we do that through partnerships.
So partnerships are about a shared accountability and responsibility, and it can be between individuals, groups of individuals, and our institutions and communities. And we really thought that, we need to spend a fair bit of time thinking about how complicated and complex all of this can be, because it changes from moment to moment. And so you start off a project with a particular kind of partnership and responsibility, but then it can change with the individuals that become involved for different reasons, right? And I think we have, so in this particular one, so this print is in memory of Wise Woman. And my grandmother was a Wise, W-Y-S-E, from Nanaimo. So my mother was a Wise. So we always joke and say we are truly the wise women, right? Yes. So anyways, but when my mother passed away, my son Dylan did this print in memory of wise women, and so it's in memory of my mother, and then of course my grandmother and all the wise women behind them. But what's important about this is that when I was given my name in 1996, Qwul'sih'yah'maht, it's my grandmother's name. And my auntie said, is Robina going to keep working up there? That's you, Vic. And as long as she's going to keep working up there, she needs a name because she can never, ever, ever forget who she is and where she's from. She's a Layaksan and a Nemo First Nations woman, and that's first and foremost who she is. I was also told that day that I had to introduce myself when I spoke publicly, consequently the way I introduced myself. I told you my name and where I'm from. Now, I don't know how many of you are Coast Salish in the room, but in that introduction, I know I was talking to Tasha's Coast Salish. So in that introduction, I'm telling Tasha who I am and where I'm from, and consequently, I'm telling her that if I mess up, she knows where to go. When you're speaking in any kind of, in a big house or in any public event where I share my name, I am saying this is who I'm responsible to and this is who I'm accountable to. And so for me, I'm accountable first and foremost to everyone who carried the name Qwul'sih'yah'maht before me. I carry them with me as I speak. I'm accountable to, to my children and my family, but I'm also accountable to my community. When I do any of the research I've done, I always make sure that it passes the rule of thumb. I call that Uncle Ben. So my Uncle Ben wants to read everything I write. And so I send it to him. And if he doesn't understand it, he says, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. Then I rewrite it, because if it's not accessible to my family, then I'm really just focusing on academic recognition. I'm not focusing on doing anything that matters to my family and my community. And so there's a huge accountability, and that really shifts the way that I do the work that I do and why I do the work that I do. It makes me accountable to the nation, to the Coast Salish people in general by doing that. It makes me accountable to any Coast Salish people that are in this room. And so who we represent changes all the time. But the other thing that we spent a fair bit talking about is that I was at a traditional adoption ceremony just a couple weeks ago. And the ceremony was magnificent, like no other adoption I've ever experienced. That aside, I was there and someone came up and said, I want you to meet someone who's a student at UVic and who's had some terrible experiences. So everywhere I go, I represent UVic. So even at this traditional ceremony, I met with a student, I met with their family, and I sat and I listened to what they had to say. So sometimes we represent, as an Indigenous person, sometimes I represent all Indigenous. Sometimes I represent all of UVic. Sometimes both. The same way that white people may represent all white people. So those will be the good and the bad experiences. And for research, this is probably the one thing we really need to consider, is as non-Indigenous researchers, when you go into a community, to be aware of the history of that community with research, with professionals, with all of that, because we may represent that. And we don't need to take it personal, but we need to figure out how to work across that difference. Getting back to the first presentation that Leslie and I had, and we talked about our responsibility to learn what the differences are and figure out how to work across those differences. And then ultimately, we are responsible and accountable to our research to make sure it represents us and that we don't get lost in that research.
And just to add a slight comment to what Robina has so articulately put out, is that it isn't just Indigenous people who have these representations and accountabilities. It's non-Indigenous people, settler people like myself, who represent the university when we're working with Indigenous communities, or represent other communities that we've worked for that maybe have recommended and said, Leslie worked with us, and so we're vouching for. I've got a responsibility to represent, and I'm accountable to the researchers and the communities I've worked with before. I represent my family, I represent my department. So we all have multiple representations that we bring forward, and knowing those and figuring out how we are going to be accountable to those groups is very important. So, time for you guys to work in small groups. I want you to get in small groups of about 5, 6 people. Introduce yourselves to one another. because that's one way that, and we'll mix that up as it goes along, so you get to meet more people here today. And then talk about who do you represent in your work, and how do you enact that accountability to those people in your work. So take 10, 15 minutes in small groups. You can move down here and get working.
It's okay to be in a group of people you're not familiar with.
Yeah, pick some new people.
These were just turned around here. Yeah.
Hopefully that was an interesting exercise for you to think about your who you represent and who you're accountable to and how. Our group got sidetracked a little before we got to the how, but we were having fun anyway. So let's go on to negotiating partnerships. And, partnerships get negotiated right from the very beginning, from your first encounter to developing an informed consent form. If you're working on a research project and you want to do that, you're negotiating that. All the way to to a prenuptial agreement, we're calling it. So you're actually getting agreement to do something together. So your partnership is negotiated all the way along. So we thought we'd start with, kind of working on this metaphor of dating to nuptials. How do you meet someone? So say you want to, be working with an Indigenous community. How do you meet someone? How do you actually begin the relationship? So I'm curious for some ideas. How would you actually go about beginning a relationship?
I say with the benefit of internet communities with websites and contact information.
Yep.
So depending on the department you're interested in working with, usually that information is all there.
Yep.
It starts with
Online dating.
Online dating. Yes.
We're a nursing, so we would contact the Aboriginal liaison nurse at Santa Peninsula Jane Fox.
Excellent. So there's people in key places that you might know that can help you make introductions. Helen.
I went to a senior colleague and asked for advice and help and said, do you know anyone from this community? And they did, and they made a match through established relationships.
Right. So going through established relationships, again, that goes back to who do you represent? Then you are representing that senior colleague when you're working with that community. So, you're accountable in some ways back to that person because their reputation is there. So we're all connected. Yeah. Any others? Tasha?
For myself, when I'm in the community, I like to go and introduce myself. I'll find who the local First Nation is and go down and introduce myself. So before I'm thinking about looking for anything, I'm just introducing myself and trying to form relationships with clients or works that know.
That's a really important one. You can develop relationships with people without an agenda to actually do a research project. So there are community events, there are all kinds of ways that you can get to know local First Nations communities. So there's just introducing yourself and developing relationships for the sake of meeting new people is always a good way to start, and then you can build on those for the future. Any other ideas? Yes?
I was just realizing I don't think I've been original in initiating anything in my research career, and I think I've always been responding to some, either planned or opportunistic invitation. So I was realizing that I've just always been responding, writing articles as well. So serendipity or happenstance.
Yeah. But making yourself available, then people will also seek you out. So that dating is two-way, right? So you can make yourself available, be in the right places, be associated with a research center or a project or other people where you can be in receipt of invitations. Yeah. Any other ideas? May?
Maybe just from like what Kelly was saying, just figuring out what common interests are. Most of my husband's NGOs, so let's say we start to do more food security work in this region with First Nations. The first thing we said is, what's already going on? So you can stop before you start and say, well, who's already doing what? Sort of an asset-based approach, and where's the synergy? But always figuring out first who's already doing what and what they're already doing well. And the First Nations be the Friendship Center or the Sonic Health Board or whatever. And we find out, well, what are they doing? And then just say, well, here's where we are at, not I am at, where we are at. where are you at? But most of the time, it's just what Kelly said. If they know you exist as a team, you've got a good track record, or there's people, then they'll come. All our community mapping work has been by invitation only, and because you've got something to share. And it's not charity too, that's a new model. It's solidarity and partnerships. There's gonna be a win-win there. We need each other. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you raised the Friendship Center for people who want to get out and meet new people. Every Friday, free lunch at the Friendship Center in town. Everybody is welcome. Soup and salad. Go down and meet some community people. Anyway, hand up over here. Oh, yes.
We had an event at the museum, and I contacted the local chief and council and invited them to come and participate and bless the grounds that they wish to.
Yeah, invite people to your events. Yeah, absolutely. This is good. All right. Then, developing a research agreement. What are the different interests? So how do you figure out what the different interests are when you're developing a research agreement? I've seen too many agreements go sideways at some point because people thought the other person or the other side in the agreement knew what everybody was after, and there wasn't enough time at the beginning to actually sort out what was really meant. So what is the actually having a conversation about your shared vision? Remember in the first one, when we talked about protocols of dignity, Robina and I, we talked about the importance of history, but the importance of the vision of the future, and having discussions about a common future can really help make sure that the agreement you're making for today is going to get you there, right? And that you have a common understanding of that. Figuring out what are the accountabilities that everybody has, what are the benefits, who benefits, how, why, and how will decisions be made, how will conflicts be resolved. All those kinds of things that are normally associated with any kind of a contract are important to talk about in a research agreement. Again, whether it be formal or informal. And, you know, we've got on here formal and informal. To figure out at the beginning, are you looking for a relationship or are you looking for a fling? And there's nothing wrong with a one-night stand. Just be clear that your partner that you're engaging with knows it's a one-night stand. So are you looking for a long-term relationship with this community and what that means? Or have you got a particular research project, you want to get it done and you're moving on? That's okay. It's about being honest about who you're dating and why and what you're looking for. Personal and professional relationships, what's expected of you as a community-based researcher? So thinking about yourself as a community-based researcher, what's expected of you as a professional as a researcher, but also what's expected of you personally, who you are. Are you expected to bring your family to community events? Are you expected to make sure that you're inviting those people to your house for dinner on Sunday? Whatever the expectations are personally, but also your expectations of them. Are you expecting them to feed you every time you show up in the community? Are you expecting them to be glad to see you? What are the expectations personally and professionally as you're thinking about your negotiating partnerships? So there are lots of aspects to negotiating partnerships, and we thought, as we were talking about this slide, we had three little stories that gave us kind of some insights into what we think about when we're negotiating partnerships. And one was about the concept of giving back, of always thinking about how are you going to give back to the community as a researcher. And sometimes you're giving back through the research itself. The research is immediately beneficial to the community. Both sides see that, and it's a good thing to do, and you're good to go. Other times, maybe the benefits are kind of far off. You know, you're developing policy. It might change policy someday. It will make something better in the long haul. But for the person right in front of you at the moment, they can't quite see the benefit in being involved in your research at the moment. And I was involved with a community up north where it was around health issues. And again, it was for about something that might benefit in the long haul, change of policy or whatever. But for the people immediately, I kept saying, you know, how can I give back? You've been so kind to me, invited me into your community. I've spent a lot of time here. How can I give back? And they kind of, around the topic area, they couldn't quite figure it out. But as I got to meet people, I found that, you know what they really needed was a walk-in bathtub. There it goes. A walk-in bathtub for the community, for the elders. Because the elders couldn't have baths. And they just wished somebody had a bathtub, maybe in their hall or something. And so I set about trying to figure out in my research budget, how do you call that? So you can buy a bathtub. So, sorry, close your ears, Rachel. Associate Vice President of Research, close your ears. But how do you buy a bathtub for a community? There's ways of doing this. So it's about giving back immediately, of figuring it out together. And it isn't charity, it isn't anything else, it's about, we're in this reciprocal relationship. And they gave me moose meat, and I gave them a bathtub, and we co-created some research together. So it's thinking about how are you giving back is kind of an ongoing thing within the partnership. And that part isn't in the formal agreement, but it's in our person-to-person connection. Sure. Charlotte.
Yeah, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about my research relationship with the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, because that's the bulk of my research right now in the last 15 or so years. And so I know people don't believe this, but I'm an extreme introvert. So I'm not shy in front of crowds, but I'm not a very social person, which I get a lot of flack for, because as an Indigenous person, people expect that we're all the same and we're all very social, which I'm not. And so it's hard for me to make relationships, personal relationships with people, and because I'm kind of shy in that context. So I have a very hard time pursuing research partnerships because it's not in my nature to seek relationships. So what I've done is I make myself available, and I do things that are asked of me that are not necessarily research related. And so back in 1999, I think it was, the folks at CAN, that's the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, contacted me. I used to work at Dalhousie. And they contacted me and said, we have 2 Aboriginal students that are wanting to do their master's research, and they need an Aboriginal academic advisor to just sort of sit with them and help them figure out what their projects are going to be and figure out what research questions. And I was like, sure, I would totally do that. So that was the beginning of this relationship that I had with them. And then they were having, I think the next year they were having like a learning institute, like a week-long learning institute for some of their community members. And they said, can you come and do a talk on qualitative research and what that looks like? And I was like, sure, I can come and do that. And so slowly I started to get to know the folks at CAN. And then those relationships, of course, CAN is a huge network across the country of Aboriginal AIDS service organizations who also have networks within their scope of practice. And there are other committees of people, Aboriginal people that are living with HIV. There's women's committees and two-spirited people's committees. And so over the last 15 years, I've sort of become connected with those people. And everybody knows sort of what I'm like, but they also know that I'm there to do whatever work needs to be done. And now we've developed over 15 years. Yes, it took that long for me to become friends with people. I'm a slow burn. But once I'm there, I'm good. But those folks, when they come, because they're in most of them are in Nova Scotia, which is where I'm from, and so when they come here now, they do stay at my house. And we have a very close, almost like a family-like relationship. I would say that we love one another. And the way that I show, and I know it might sound dorky, but the way that I show my affection or love for the folks that I work with is doing the work that I do, because that's a way that's comfortable for me to show my affection, right? So yeah, that's been like, and I would imagine that relationship will go on as long as I live, or as long as I last, whichever comes first. Yeah, and so that was the thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about that. Thank you.
So mine is whose voices get heard, and one of the things, I was involved in a residential school. My thesis was on residential school, sharing 3 stories of Cooper Island students. And when I did that, I said, I want to tell your story. And so I interviewed them for months and months and months on end. Some of them 17, 18, 20 hours long worth of interviews. But at the end of it all, I had to tell a story. And so I would just keep listening to these interviews over and over again and going back to the storytellers with the story. And so with Delmar, it actually worked really well. Late Delmar Johnny Seletza from Qwul'sih'yah'maht, it worked quite well because his voice was so clear in his interviews. And so when I started thinking about how to tell his stories, I could pick up his language. And plus I've known him really well for many years. Bellevue wasn't quite as easy, but it was much easier. But my cousin Herman was really hard. It was really, really hard how to put my thumb on how to tell Herman's story. So we started, and first thing that I did was I wrote his story in a particular way, because when he talked about residential school, he kept saying, I would never let anything take control of my life again. And it was a real focus of his from residential school that he had been controlled. Every aspect of his life had been controlled. That he would never let anything take control of his life. And some of these things were really important decisions, like when he thought he was starting to struggle with drugs and alcohol, quit. They're taking control of my life. Cigarettes, quit. So some of them were really important life decisions, and how he wanted to live his life were really important. But some of them were kind of funny. Like, he refused to eat particular fruit. Apples were one of them, because he was forced to eat an apple a day at the residential school. He was an amazing guitar player, but he refused to pick up a guitar because when he was in residential school, they would parade him around and make him play the guitar for government agencies. And you know, when visitors came to the school, Herman would have to stand up and pull out his guitar and play his guitar. So he refused to play the guitar. So I brought these things to his attention, and he was really quite pissed off at me at first. And I was like, oh, okay. So I said to Herman, well, we won't tell the story that way. We'll tell it a different way because this is your story, it's not mine. Anyways, eventually Herman said, no, it's actually really true, and I'd never realized the extent to which I was letting the residential school guide me. So it was still controlling me, even though it was from a different way than I expected. So anyway, so we got over that hump, but then we were, trying to fine tune. I was getting to the end of the draft of my thesis, and I'm trying to find these transitions in a couple of places from kind of one topic to the other. So I was playing with this one and brought it up to Herman, and he read it, and he just burst out laughing, and he says, oh, Robina, that's so your voice. That's never how I would say that. And so it was constantly negotiating the story, the words, and how that would all look. And that would have never happened had I not had a really solid relationship with him, where he could say, I wouldn't say that, or that's not how I would tell my story. And so it's really important. The other last little bit of information that came out of there around whose words get heard, how does the story get picked up, is in that work, Delmer told me at one point that those stories were shared with me for a reason, and that I have to be the voice for the voiceless, and particularly those who have gone to the other side. And both Delmer and another one of my mentors, late Art Thompson, told me that when I'm asked to speak about residential school, I have to say yes. That those stories were given to me so that I could speak about them. And just yesterday, I made a presentation to the Island Health Board on St. Mike's Residential School and what it meant, the significance of them demolishing that institution. And so even today, after all these years, I'm called upon now to speak about residential schools because of those experiences. And I really still feel that I'm accountable to those storytellers and the advice that they gave me. And so that's a bit of negotiating partnerships, is that continued accountability to those storytellers.
All right, so now let's talk about ethical responsibility. And first off, this piece of art was done by Randy Cook, and it just seemed to appeal to us to go with the idea of self-determination. One of the things that we got talking about, the three of us, about what is key about working with Indigenous communities and doing research with Indigenous communities is research is a political act. And acknowledging that the research that we do with Indigenous communities is to support self-determination and the ethics that go along with that. Oops. There it is. So we thought we'd ask you to get back in your groups again and talk about, if you're doing research that is in support of self-determination of Indigenous peoples, what does that mean for your research? Given we're a university and you're graduate students or faculty or any other kind of research, or what does it mean to do research that is in support of self-determination, that's got that political goal to it? So take, again, another 10, 15 minutes in your small groups and have a discussion around the ethics of self-determination in research. So part of self-determination is the ethical responsibilities. So Charlotte was going to talk about ethics, particularly the principles of OCAP. We wanted to make sure that people knew about these ethical principles, because these are often the principles that we use in our work of working with Indigenous communities. So over to you.
Hello again. Yeah, so I don't know if folks are familiar with OCAP principles. So back in the 90s, you might remember a little event called OCA, where, in Quebec. And so out of that came this acronym, which was kind of meant it was kind of meant as a joke at first. So the First Nations, I think at the time it was the Assembly of First Nations, I believe, were taking on a project to do national research on the health of First Nations, unreserved First Nations people. And so in developing some of the protocols that they were going to undertake in doing this, so they were taking that responsibility away from Statistics Canada, who still does an off-reserve survey called the Aboriginal People Survey. But this particular survey, which started out being called the First Nations and Inuit Regional Longitudinal Health Survey, then the Inuit dropped out, and then we started doing it on a regional basis longitudinally, and then lots of people were not getting longitudinal data, so we had to drop that part. So now it's the First Nations Regional Health Survey. But there were, but at the beginning of this, in the mid-90s, the committee that was struck to actually develop the protocols for the survey started saying, we need some principles and protocols in place to actually protect communities from research. And so it started out with, it was called OCA, O-C-A, rather than O-K-A, which was the place where the event took place in early 90s? Yeah. And so in this case, the acronym means ownership, control, access, and possession. And so this has gone through several iterations and several organizations. This particular definition that I'm going to be giving you today is by the recently, circa 2012, defunded National Aboriginal Health Organization, but this is the one that we still use. These principles were used to inform the Canadian Institutes of Health Research ethical guidelines that were also not used, but they were repurposed and informed the guidelines that are currently used by the Tri-Council policy. So that's SHRC and CIRC and CIHR, and that was rolled into the Chapter 9 of their Tri-Council policies. So the first one is really about ownership. And this relates to what we were just talking about in terms of self-determination. So it occurred to me while you guys were talking that some of you may not fully understand what we mean when we say self-determination as it relates to Indigenous peoples' lives and communities and nations. And so in this case, within the research context, when we say ownership, it means not necessarily a literal possession, although that can be part of it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is about ownership in a principled way. In the same way that if I said to you, will you tell me the story of your life? And you tell me the story of your life. I write it down, and then I keep it in my backpack. Well, you still own that story. You've shared it with me, but it doesn't mean that now I have some control over it in terms of what gets done with it, right? So that's the principle, is that not only individually does each person own their own information story, but collectively, a community, a nation, a collection of nations owns, i.e. has the right to determine what gets done with and how it gets used and who gets to see it, the information that other people have gathered from them. Make sense? Awesome. So the next principle is about control. Now again, obviously these four principles are kind of related to each other, but in this case, it's one of the reasons, except for my extreme introversion, but it's one of the reasons that I don't pursue communities to engage in research, because control can mean everything from the inception of a research project or the idea, the definition of a problem, an issue, a challenge, an intervention, right to the very end of knowledge mobilization, knowledge sharing. So everything in that sort of scope of a research project can be and is controlled by somebody, right? We don't often pick it apart in that way to think about it, but it's sort of like self-reflection, right? If you're being self-reflective, you kind of almost have to separate things out to understand why we do the things we do. So in this case, we have to first acknowledge that somebody is going to control this process, and then as researchers, if we're working in a decolonizing way, and we're trying to abide by the principles of OCAP, and there are other principles, don't get me wrong, but this is the one that people use most often, then we have to start saying who among us, who's the designate for the community, for the nation, etc., that are going to either take control or have control or share control. Because sometimes as researchers, communities will come to me and say, we'd like you to do a research project on ... and this is how we want it laid out. The minutia of it, you do it. We don't care like what the sample size is or that type of thing. But overall, we're going to control that, right? And so if the community is not, the word consultation, just so people know, has become sort of almost a bad word sometimes for some communities, because consultation usually means we've made the important decisions and now we're going to check with you about implementing them. It doesn't really mean you have control, right? And so the way that I think about it is that, if we accept the fact that we do not own the information, then it makes sense. Like we're basing our work on that fundamental principle that we do not own the information, then it stands to reason that we do not control the process of gathering, of formulating or gathering or making sense of or sharing that information. You with me so far? Am I soapboxing? We've talked about this already, so I won't sort of go over this in too much detail, but this notion of access, again, relates to ownership. So it makes very little sense if we assume communities own their information, that those communities don't have access to the findings of any research that gets done, right? And so in terms of control doesn't just mean that people help make decisions or make those decisions. It means that they have access to the resources to actually do what they want to do. So if a community says to me, we want one of our community members to be involved in the data collection and the analysis of the data, and we need some training for that person. So this goes beyond, at least in my work, it goes beyond actually accessing information. It means accessing the resources necessary for the communities to take ownership and to take control or have control over the research process, right? So that means access to the resources necessary to do this, right? And so again, sometimes this means we write this out. We've talked about this before, and I was going to just wait to the end, but sometimes this all gets written into a formal agreement, like how these things are going to play out, and sometimes it doesn't. And so possession is really the literal sense or the literal concept of ownership, right? And so in many ways, in many cases, researchers will gather information, whether it's numbers that get written down or typed into a laptop or words in the form of interview transcripts, and then we take them back to our universities and we hidey hold them in our filing cabinets that are supposed to be locked. Usually aren't. But I'm tattling now. And this, for those of you that are sort of junior in this process, you might say, well, of course the community is gonna have literal possession of this stuff, but this is a fairly new thing. When I was doing my dissertation back in 1999, I had to actually have a meeting with the ethics board of Dalhousie to explain to them why the communities that were involved in my dissertation research had to have a copy of all of the information that I gathered, like all the transcripts and all of that. And so, because the university didn't really understand why that was, and I was using the OCAP principles at the time, and so it was a very new thing. And so what we might be taking for granted now is actually still a fairly new thing. And in some research, like, I don't want to poop on anybody's pillow. That doesn't sound
Back to the dating concept.
yeah. I've never pooped on anybody's pillow, or my own. But just not to say that NSERP or that a certain kind of scientific research, but so some areas of research are further ahead in their thinking about the possession of information, and some people haven't even thought about it yet. They say, what, or why would we do that, right? And so if you talk to a community, they would tell you very clearly why we do that, right? And so, should I keep going?
Yep.
And so, yeah, because we're going to, just one more. And so I already talked about the Tri-Council policy. And so the Tri-Council policy, unfortunately, in my opinion, is a bit watered down because there are principles and suggestions in that policy that with very little teeth. It doesn't say you must do, it says you should do. Fortunately, we have great ethics here at Dell. Oh, now I'm going to get my pillow pooped on. Next time I come up for some money or something. Here's your pillow. At UVic, we have great ethics review that really includes a lot of very specific questions about how we're going to enact these principles, which is great. And again, you know, in a very broad way, the Tri-Council policy statement relates to not just respect for the person, because we all kind of get that part, but concern for social justice. And social justice is about making sure that we are not creating inequities, inequities being avoidable inequalities, right? But that's what we're really trying to do. So the question is, how can we use what we now know of the OCAP principles to engage in respectful research with Aboriginal communities? And then what are the challenges in doing that? And then how can we address them? So those of you who are working for a university will be very clear on what those challenges are. But we'd like you to get into your groups. One more time?
Yeah, one more time.
One more time. Well, that was totally off key. Let me try that again. If you could get into your groups one more time and really just say, like, talk about how you might, I mean, if you've used the OCAP principles in the past, how was that process for you? What were some of the challenges, and how did you address them? If not, what do you foresee as some of the challenges in doing that? Okay? Happy? Good?
25. Yeah.
10, 25 too? So 10 minutes.
All right, I did want to explain, we've got the witness blanket artwork here by Carrie Newman. I don't know if any of you saw the witness blanket when it was here at UVic last May, but Carrie collected, how many hundred, 600-700 pieces of residential schools, churches, governments, people who are, organizations that were involved with residential school, and created them into an amazing wall that runs 40 feet long, and it's on a cross-Canada tour for the next 7 years. But if you go to witnessblanket.ca, you can see the whole installation. It's not a blanket, it's cedar, and it's about this high and 40 feet long, and it's sitting on rows and rows of Indian acts. At the bottom there, all the little squares are Indian acts in there. And UVic has a contribution right beside the door at the top. But if you go on the website, what we're working on now is you'll be able to take your mouse over any of the little things and you'll be able to click on it and it'll take you to where that piece came from and the story of that residential school or whatever, where the contribution came from. So that's the next stage of the project. It was a research project, it was an art project, it was a trying to give back, trying to enact some of the principles about self-determination. Yes?
What is the website again?
witnessblanket.ca. Yeah, witnessblanket.ca.
And the picture at the very top in the
Yes.
window was from the residential school art project that was donated to UVic. And that was painted by late Art Thompson from Dididat. And his family donated that to the Witness Blanket.
Yeah. And the doors from St. Mike's in Millard Bay, which was the residential school that was just taken down.
The work you're doing with the Witness Blanket to digitize all of the components and to link to something behind that is a kind of a digital publication. What are you doing to make sure that it's archived in the long term?
It's not my project, so I'm not doing anything. But I will certainly ask that question of the people who are.
This is the kind of thing that you worry about when
Yeah.
that server dies, when the person moves along. What's going to happen with this
Yeah.
really important cultural
Yeah.
publication, really, online publication, and who's going to look after it in the long term, 50 years from now?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that might be another way that UVic, because right now it's held by Kerry, and he's doing it, and it might be another service that UVic could offer to him. I mean, aside, he was able to unveil it for the first time here and had some of us involved in the project, but that might be something. Yeah, thanks for that. I'll talk to him about that. All right, Charlotte had to leave to go catch a ferry to go to a community up at Lillooet for some research she's doing, but we wanted to allow a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. And also, while we're answering questions, we want to end as we have the other two with a small gift to thank you for coming. We really appreciate the honor of you being in this space with us today. We've got edible treats. Easter's coming. We were craving chocolate. 3 women were craving chocolate. They're all getting chocolate today. But any questions for Robina or I before we call her quits?
How do you guys see things have changed along the way over the past 10 years, let's say, since you both started doing this? You've been doing it for many years. But what are the trends? What gives you hope?
Oh, there's lots that gives me hope. I mean, we're in a place that just exudes hope from, as Robina said, it started in the School of Social Work when she and I were in school many, many years ago. That gives me hope. The fact that many of the communities have their own ethical codes. Sarah is doing some wonderful work on transportation safety on reserve. And now when we're going to communities, often she'll have to go, she goes, and presents to committees and has to make an argument of what's in it for them, who benefits, how we're going to develop our relationships, what's the agreements, all those sorts of things. So there are more communities that are way more aware of the importance of developing good relationships. So I think that's good. We're more aware in our research departments of some of the questions that need to be asked and concerns. And we've got, frankly, the biggest difference at UVic is the number of Indigenous faculty members. The number of Indigenous faculty members increases the number of Indigenous students, which increases the awareness generally of our systems around how to work with Indigenous communities. And so we're started, and we've still got a long way to go.